Over on my website, goingalone.org, I have a page that is called Literary Sightings of the Great Indifference. And what I do is, in my reading, if I run across some author who writes as though they've maybe had some peripheral or direct sighting of that thing that I call the Great Indifference, and they wouldn't call it that, but I would probably know it when they described it. I would pluck that out and capture that. I don't have too many items on that page, but I keep it there just in case. And today, or really yesterday, I found one to add. I'm reading, it's a very interesting book by Samuel Johnson and James Boswell. 2 books, actually. 3 books, really. 2 books is A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. That's by Dr. Johnson. And then The Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides, which is by his friend James Boswell. The 2 men traveled in 1774, 73, from England up to Edinburgh, Scotland, and then across up to Aberdeen, and then to Inverness, and then along the Loch Ness, and then up into the Highlands and to the islands of that are on the west coast of Scotland. The Hebrides, that's what it is. Yeah, across the Highlands and then through the Hebrides. Kind of lost the name there. Anyway, and I'm at the point in the book. The first part of the book, first roughly a third of the book, is Dr. Johnson's account of it, and then the part by James Boswell is his notes about his observation of Dr. Johnson's experience. So it's apparently Dr. Johnson was such a luminary of the 18th century that I run across this all the time. Yeah, people constantly referring to Dr. Johnson as someone whose charisma and his breadth of knowledge and his eloquence and also his writing ability were such that you wouldn't want to miss a moment. So James Boswell felt so compelled to actually, when they were traveling together, he didn't write about his experience of the Scottish Highlands and the Hebrides, but Dr. Johnson's experience as he saw it. Very interesting. So it's interesting to compare the two, especially since James Boswell was a Scot. Samuel Johnson was in some ways a rather, what's the right word? Pretentious? Ostentatious Englishman. He saw the English as a cut above in a way, and in many cases James Boswell is trying to correct him along the way as he sometimes seemingly disparages the Scottish, maybe touching on some of the prejudices of the time. But anyway, I'm at a point in the book now where they have, like I said, they've made their way along Loch Ness. No comments about any Loch Ness monsters. But they did make a comment about how Loch Ness never freezes, and I found out that is in fact the case. Well, I mentioned it's kind of like 3 books because there's this last bit here. The people who compiled the book, there's some scholars, they added really good comprehensive notes at the end, and their note indicated that Loch Ness does not freeze, and that's because the cold water, as it chills at the top, it sinks down, and it's of such depth that it just sinks down and is replaced by warmer water that it simply never freezes. And it was interesting to read Dr. Johnson's attempt to understand that from a scientific perspective without knowing that fact. It was interesting. Anyway, so now picture this. So Dr. Johnson and James Boswell, along with 2 Highlanders, which are their guides, kind of taking care of the horses that they're riding on, and a servant of James Boswell, who is basically of nobility, Scottish nobility. So they've got this 5 men and 2 horses traveling into the Highlands. They're just embarking, and they've reached a point where they're starting to embark up into the higher lands of the moors, right? And they've reached kind of a grassy section, and the Scotsmen, the guides, indicate that we need to stop here and let the horses graze in the grass for an hour or so before we head off, because we won't see much grass for a while. So they agree, and Dr. Johnson and Boswell get down, and Johnson finds himself over by the side of a little mountainish creek, as it's going by, kind of gurgling past. And he sits down at the side and he tries to collect his thoughts. And he captures that in two instances. I'm going to read to you. So I'm going to read to you three passages. Let me find the third. I didn't quite prepare myself for that. The narration. Just bear with me just a second. There it is. Okay, the first is Johnson setting the stage, talking about where he's about to sit down. Now, of course, remember this is writing from late 1770s. It's rather beautiful. Can I let go with my bias? I think the writing from that period is just astonishing, but it's a little hard to follow sometimes by our modern standards, vocabulary, sentence structure, grammar especially. But I think let's follow along. So first, remember, picture Dr. Johnson making his way over to Little River and sitting down and kind of looking around. Remember, they're just on the outskirts going into the middle of nowhere, the highlands. I sat down on a bank, such as a writer of romance might have delighted to feign. So he uses the word romance, is it capitalized? Now, of course, romance writers they wrote a special type of, it doesn't, not like we think about romance today of, passionate embrace, but instead of, it's more like things like Scarlet Letter, even though that comes 100 years later. Nathaniel Hawthorne was a very famous American romance writer. Scarlet Letter, the House of the Seven Gables, not necessarily about love, but about human sentiment and the human experience in a way. That's kind of how they meant that term romance. I sat down on a bank such as a writer of romance might have delighted to feign. I had indeed no trees to whisper over my head, but a clear rivulet streamed at my feet. The day was calm, the air soft, and all was rudeness, silence, and solitude. Before me, on either side, were high hills, which by hindering the eye from ranging, forced the mind to find entertainment for itself. Whether I spent the hour well, I know not, for here I first conceived the thought of this narration. So he's describing the situation, very compelling to the thought, and then the paragraph to follow will be the third paragraph I'll read, not the next one. The paragraph to follow will be the one that was the spawn of his reflection. Now I'm going to read the next, which is, remember I said that at the end of the book there's great notes that the editors put together. This is from Johnson's letter to his friend Hester Thrall, who was a rather noteworthy journalist at the time. Apparently, being a journalist, not journalist as in like writing for a magazine, but journalist as in keeping a journal. She was a noteworthy journalist at the time, and we know a lot about Dr. Johnson from his letters to her. He happened to write to her and mention that exact same experience, but in slightly different words. Here we go. So this is Johnson's letter to Thrall. I sat down to make notes on a green bank with a small stream running at my feet in the midst of savage solitude, with mountains before me, mountains is capitalized for some reason, and on either hand covered with heath. I looked round me and wondered that I was not more affected, but the mind is not at all times equally ready to be put in motion. So what that tells me there is that he was having a little bit of trouble with his muse. He was thinking that this is a great setting for my inspiration to strike, and yet it didn't. Boy, I've had that experience as well. I often describe to people that the reason, anyone who asks, why do I go to the desert? Why do I go to a bridge? Why do I go to a ghost town? And I reflect that. I tell them that that's basically where my muse lives, and I go there and I can write. And clearly, Johnson, I've run into this, author after author has described the same thing, where there's certain circumstances that are conducive to writing. And then the words just flow. And for me, there's been several circumstances in my life that do that. Lately, it's that bridge out by the Siberia ghost town. And for Dr. Johnson, he was a little bit surprised that the muse didn't quite strike. Funny that, because the next paragraph that it's in yellow here is the bit that I'm going to read. And I want to give you a little bit of advance warning. This is one of those instances where I believe that the author cited what to me would be the the precursor to the experience of the Great Indifference. Now, of course, that's my term, the Great Indifference. If you want to know what the Great Indifference is, you can watch some of my videos on this channel to that effect, the Going Alone videos, or you can read my book, The Going Alone, where I describe it. But in short, it's basically the emptiness of the universe, the apprehension of a universe without God, empty of loving, caring, any direction, and that understanding that we're basically seem to be on our own. We just have each other. Now what? So here we go. Here's Dr. Johnson's reflection, sitting in there thinking, wow, this is pretty heavy, and here's what he's had to say about it. We were in this place at ease and by choice, and had no evils to suffer or to fear. Yet the imaginations excited by the view of an unknown and untraveled wilderness are not such as arise in the artificial solitude of parks and gardens. So picture that. He's saying, here we are, there's no danger here. We're not running away from any danger, or we're not here because we're at war or traveling to anywhere. We're here just on very safe and sober grounds. Yet he's noting that there's something different about this compared to the solitude that can be found in parks and gardens. Now picture in the 18th century England, where we would have the very, nature was very basically conquered, right? You could picture the manicured gardens, with the geometric shapes, the topiaries, the lines of flowers. Nature is not wild. Nature is conquered. Man has subdued nature, and he's saying that you could be walking through one of those types of places. Imagine Kensington Park, I think, is one that I remember walking through. I'm particularly struck by. There's a beautiful park near the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam that is just like that. It kind of looks natural, but you can tell it isn't. But even if you were sitting there alone, it's not quite the same. And he's touching on that. And this might have been for Johnson the very first time he experiences this. He does write elsewhere to that same woman, the diarist, the same thing, that this was the first time for him to be in a place where no one maybe had ever been. So he thought he was very excited about it. So one more time, yet the imaginations excited by the view of an unknown and untraveled wilderness are not such as arise in the artificial solitude of parks and gardens. Very astute observation that he's making. Going on, and he's going to now catalog a few of the things that you might feel in a park or a garden. A flattering notion of self-sufficiency, a placid indulgence of voluntary delusions, a secure expansion of the fancy, or a cool concentration of the mental powers. All of these things are very positive, uplifting, self-reassuring experiences that one can have sitting alone in a man-made natural park or garden. Imagine that. Just one more time. Just take that whole 2 or 3 sentences there from the beginning. Yet the imaginations excited by the view of an unknown and untraveled wilderness are not such as arise in the artificial solitude of parks and gardens. A flattering notion of self-sufficiency, a placid indulgence of voluntary delusions, a secure expansion of the fancy, or a cool concentration of the mental powers. No. What I'm experiencing here, he's saying, is none of that. What is it then, you wonder? Here we go. The phantoms which haunt a desert. It's curious that he uses the word desert. Okay, the moors are perhaps not a desert, so to speak, if a desert is identified as lack of moisture. They get plenty of rainfall, but it certainly is a desolate place. The phantoms which haunt a desert are want and misery and danger, semicolon. A little bit of a pause there. The phantoms which haunt a desert are want and misery and danger. The evils of dereliction rush upon the thoughts. Another semicolon. So he's causing us to linger a little bit between these major thoughts, right? Again, the phantoms which haunt a desert are want and misery and danger. The evils of dereliction rush upon the thoughts. Man is made unwillingly acquainted with his own weakness, and meditation shows him only how little he can sustain and how little he can perform. Now, if anything speaks to the observations that so many have made about what an incredible individual Dr. Johnson was, Dr. Samuel Johnson was, I get it now. If this is indeed his very first touch of wildness. The very first time in places maybe where no one had ever been, although probably somebody had been there before, but from his perspective, that's the case. And to have picked up so quickly and so comprehensively the distinction between what one can feel and sense and perceive and think about alone in a sober and sane setting like a park or a garden, versus the challenge that comes in a setting of wilderness. He sits down, spots it, writes it about it in his journal, and is prepared to then expand upon that later when he writes the proper book. I'm blown away, frankly. This is a very, very keen observation and astute observation of that emptiness that I perceive when I go out to the desert. The difference being that I go on to then describe it as nothingness. This thing that he's describing that rushes, this dereliction of thoughts that rush upon us, come when you realize the awful, and in terms of the powerful, the overwhelming sense of emptiness that's out there. Had he been alone, without his partner Boswell, without the two Highlanders as their guides, without the manservant, as much silly as that sounds, and the two horses, if he had been alone and had got there of his own motive power, and was without a compass, without a map, without appropriate provisions, and maybe a little cold and a little afraid, and at that point seeing that place, and yet pushing a little bit further beyond that little rivulet up into the moors a little bit to look as the mists move across the moor. Could Dr. Johnson have then spotted the Great Indifference? Certainly he wouldn't have called it that, but could he have spotted it? Could he have apprehended that thing, that emptiness? Would it have challenged his notion of God? I think he was a religious man. Would it have left him wondering what to do? Who was it I was reading this morning? I was just reading Tolstoy this morning. I was reading a little bit of Tolstoy's biography, and at one point when Tolstoy had was struck by nihilism, and he actually wrote how he was. Nihilism, of course, being that sense that the universe has no purpose, no meaning, and he was prompted almost to suicide. Tolstoy almost killed himself as a result, and in result, he turned to religion to save, to maybe to rescue himself from that, as perhaps so many of us do. I happen to be one that my nihilism didn't destroy me. I think it simply compelled me to find a purpose for life. That's what I wrote. The Good Life. The Good Life is my answer to the Great Indifference. It is my response to nihilism, to not to despair, and to off myself for recognizing that the universe appears to be unguided, but to instead to do my best to make good use of the time, find objectives and principles that I can along the way, and live according to those in the 17 odd years that the actuarial tables say I have left. But enough about me. Amazing work here, Dr. Johnson, to have discovered this in such short order, so quickly upon arriving in the wilderness. I can't wait to read more and discover what more you've discovered out there. Truly incredible writer, and I'm debating in my mind. There's a collection at a used bookstore in Ventura of the entire writings of Samuel Johnson. It's in the window there. It's about 11-12 volumes. Very pricey though, but very hard to find because he's not an author that's very well read anymore. Tempted to buy it. Anyway, I better stop for now. It's time for me to go get pizza for my family. It's a Friday night after all. I hope you're all having a great time wherever you are, and remember, be safe but not too safe, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.